بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين عليه وعلى آله وصحبه ومن سار على دربه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد. We begin by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we send our peace and blessings among our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. My dear respected brothers and sisters in Islam, this is the second lesson of the history of legislation, in which I spoke about that I will be delivering in 3 lessons inshallah. So we've completed the first one last week, now we are on the second lesson, and inshallah next week will be the last. Now, before I begin this lesson, I'm going to pick your brains again. A recap from last week. Who can tell me inshallah what's the difference between fiqh and sharia? Do we remember? I've got a hand up there. Yep.
Fiqh is a part of sharia. It comes under the umbrella of sharia. It also has things like adab.
Very good. So sharia is it's the main one. It's the general one, and fiqh is a part of sharia. Now, inshallah, we spoke about 2 main parts of legislation during the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What are those 2 main parts? There's 2 main parts during the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this signified the 2 parts of legislation during his lifetime. 2 parts. Makkah and Medina. Very good. What are the sources of legislation during the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? There's 2 of them, and we all know them. What are they? Qur'an, Sunnah. Very good. طيب. In this lesson, inshallah, we are going to move on from one of the major errors of legislation, one of the major errors of Islam, major time period that is, which is the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Now, after this very, very major part in which the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he lived through it, and we experienced, the Sahaba, they experienced the revelation, and they experienced the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ for 23 years as being a prophet. A new era begins. And you can imagine, after 23 years, the Sahaba had the Prophet there. Any questions they had, they would run to the Prophet. They would run to the Prophet. If they never knew of something, they would run to him and they'll get answers of him. And if the Prophet ﷺ didn't know, he would wait for revelation to come down. But now that the Prophet ﷺ died, revelation also stopped. Because we know that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is the very last messenger, right? He is Khatamun Nabiyyin. He's the seal of all prophets. So there's no prophet after him, i.e. there's no wahi after him, i.e. there's no more Jibreel coming down giving any more revelation. So now, the Sahaba had to use what they had. And what did they have? They had the 2 sources, Qur'an and Sunnah, right? Now, last week I mentioned the hadith in which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he speaks to one of his companions and he says to him, if you cannot find something in the Qur'an, what do? He says, I will look into the Sunnah. And then he says, if you cannot find it in the Sunnah, then what do? Then he says, I will use my ijtihad. And then the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, Alhamdulillah alladhi waffaqa Rasulillah ala ma yurdi Rasulallah. So he says here, Alhamdulillah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has guided the messenger of Allah to the right path. Now, in this period in which we discussed last week, there are 6 periods of Islam, right? And the first one was the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then the second one was, who can help me? Yep. The four Khalifas. After the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the next period of legislation is the 4 Khalifas: Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. So during that time, this is another time the Prophet the scholars, they have divided the history of legislation in. And I'm going to speak about this time now. So which time are we speaking about? The time of the 4 rightly guided Khalifa, right? So in this time, they had sources of legislation, just like the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had sources of legislation. Now, what was the source of legislation for the Prophet? It was the Qur'an and Sunnah. What is it for the 4 rightly guided Khalifas? It's the Qur'an and the Sunnah. Doesn't change, right? Now, we spoke a bit about the Qur'an last week, and we spoke a bit about the Sunnah. Now, I want to speak a little bit more about the Qur'an, and more about the compilation of the Qur'an, that is. Now, during the time of the Prophet, as I mentioned last week, the Qur'an was sent down orally. It wasn't written, right? It wasn't given down as like in a written form. It wasn't sent down in a written form like a book, okay? So it was sent down orally. And then the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would have companions around him who would write down the Qur'an, either on some bones, on some parch, on some bark, on some leather, whatever they can find, and they used to write the Qur'an. Now, the Qur'an was compiled over 4 stages. So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not leave this world, so he did not die, except that the Qur'an was completely written. Okay, first of all, it's completely memorized by thousands of Sahaba. Okay, and then also he didn't leave unless it was completely written as well. So you had one Sahabi who had written one ayah, another Sahabi who had written another ayah, and another Sahabi who had written another ayah. So there was all these ayat everywhere, but it was all written at the same time. So these written forms of the Qur'an were also, they were all combined, so to speak, because every Sahabi had 1 or 2, someone else had another 3, and someone else had 10. So they were all combined and put together, and they were ordered in the way the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam had ordered them to be, in the sequence that they were put in. So Fatiha first, Baqarah next, and then Ali Imran, and whatnot. So it moves on, right? Now, the wisdom behind the Qur'an not being revealed in one hit. Why was the Qur'an never revealed in one book? Now, the wisdom behind that is one. Look, I can see Umar smiling, because he speaks about that all the time, right? During straight dawah, they use that. Why is it that the Qur'an was not revealed in one book? Why is it revealed over a period of time? What's the wisdom behind it? Now, there's a few wisdoms. One of the wisdoms is that it solidifies the heart of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's one. 2, it proves to all the non-Muslims that this has to be wahi. Why? Prophet of Allah could not read or write, and he was sent down orally, and he was sent down over a period of time. So it wasn't actually written. So if the Prophet ﷺ couldn't read or write, and he didn't have a physical book in his hand, then it had to be of wahi, right? It had to be of wahi. That's another wisdom of it being sent down. Now, also, it was sent down according to the occasions and the events that happened during the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, in which we explained last week. Now, this was the first, they say this is the first compilation of the Qur'an, in which all of these verses that were scattered around in every person's house, it was all compiled and put into one place and put into that order. Now, the second compilation, this was after Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he took on the Khalifa, right? He took on the Khalifa. So after the death of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he took on the Khalifa, and he took on the leading role of the Muslims. And so in his time, Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he suggested to Abu Bakr, he came to him and he said to him, "Oh, Abu Bakr, why don't we compile the Qur'an? As in, compile it into a written form." And then he said, Abu Bakr was very hesitant, extremely hesitant. He said, "How can I do something that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam never did? How can I do something that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam never did?" Now, after weeks and weeks and weeks of continuous, Umar ibn al-Khattab was really insisting on Abu Bakr to make that a decision where they compile the Qur'an in a written form. Eventually, Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu agrees, and Abu Bakr, he orders all of the ayat to come together in one place. And they had written, they had compiled, they put all the Qur'an in one place, and now they had, in the first compilation of the Qur'an is only that they are written on parchments and bones. The second, which was during the time of the Prophet Abu Bakr, he grabbed them all together and he put them in order. So the first one, so let me go back to the first one. The first one was not that they grabbed together, they were just written in every ayah was written and they were placed in a place. Either in some places, some person's house, in the masjid, wherever it is. In the second compilation, during the time of Abu Bakr, they grabbed all of those and they put them in the order in which they should be. Now the third compilation, in which we are all very, very familiar of, which was during the time of Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And we all know that Uthman is the one who compiled the Qur'an. Now there's a reason why Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he compiled the Qur'an and is very famous about it, because we know that the Qur'an was also sent down in ahruf. It wasn't just sent down in one dialect. Okay? And the reason why I say dialect is because the Arab, they used to have different words they used to use according to different tribes. Okay? Now, the dialects that were sent down was 7 dialects. The Qur'an was sent down in 7 ahruf. Right? And the one that we have today is from Quraysh. So the dialect of who? Of Quraysh, which was the tribe of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But there was also other dialects. Now, during that time, there was a big fitna. During the time of Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu. During that time, some people from a particular dialect or their tribe, they would say that our dialect is more proficient and profound than your dialect. So that began all these debates that are our ayah or our Qur'an, and became like a bit of a debate, and people started to fight over it, and wallahi my Qur'an is better than your Qur'an, and that kind of talk. So Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, with his wisdom, he decided to burn all of the Qur'ans, burn all of the dialects, and leave one dialect. That's the dialect of Quraysh. He left that dialect. So the Qur'an that we have today is on the dialect of Quraysh. So this is what Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu did. He burned all of the Qur'ans, and he wrote he wrote the Qur'an. We actually have the physical Qur'an that he wrote as well in the I think it's in the Topkapi Museum in Turkey, where he wrote it. Or afwan, not he wrote it, but it was under his name, right? He ordered the companions to write it according to the Qurayshi dialect. Now, Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu did this. That's the third compilation of the Qur'an. Right. Now, we spoke about it last week, and I'm going to mention it again for the sake of understanding. The Qur'an has its clear verses and its ambiguous verses. Right? During the time of the 4 Khulafa, the companions had difference of opinion. Why? Because of those clear verses and the non-clear verses. So the clear verses and the ambiguous verses. The ones that would have room for more than one meaning. Now we spoke about it last week. How? We spoke and we gave the example where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Qur'an, وَالْمُطَلَّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوء. Do we remember that example? Do I see heads nodding? I see 1, 2. Very good, out of 50. It's alright. فَثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوء. Do you remember that word قُرُوء? That's the jama' word for qur'. And that also means, in the Arabic language, either the bleeding period of the woman or the non-bleeding period. Now, they use it in both contexts. So Sahabis, some Sahabi took it this way, some Sahabi took it that way. Some Sahabi said, no, it's the bleeding period. Some Sahabi said, no, it's the non-bleeding period. So here again, during the time of the four khulafa, they had difference of opinion when it came to clear and ambiguous verses. So this was one reason why they had ikhtilaf. I'll say it again, clear and ambiguous verses. So not everything in the Qur'an is 100% clear, right? There are verses that are 100% clear. There are. But there are also verses that are ambiguous, where there's room for other meanings. Now, we said that the second source during the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was the Sunnah. Same thing. During the time of the four Khulafa, the Sunnah was also the main source. Now, we also gave the example of the clear and the ambiguous examples of the Sunnah, in which Rasulullah ﷺ says, لا يصلين أحدكم إلا في بني قريظة, that none of you will pray Salat al-Asr except in the city Bani Qurayza, when he was walking with the companions. So one companion, he understood, okay, we have to pray when we get there. No one's praying until we get there. So he got there and he prayed, right? And then there was one person who was walking on the way, and he said, no, the Prophet ﷺ said that so we can rush, but I'm still going to pray. But he only said that so we can rush, so we can get to the place, right? So he prayed. And then the Prophet ﷺ got there, and all the companions got there. Those two companions, they went to the Prophet ﷺ, they told him what happened, and he said to them that you are both correct, right? He said to them that you are both correct. I'm going to say it again. He said to them, you are both correct. Okay? So there's a way that one person can understand this hadith in a particular manner, and another person can understand this hadith in another particular manner, right? But they're both correct. Okay? So here the Prophet ﷺ, here the companions, they also used the Sunnah, and there was difference of opinion. Now, something new. We spoke about the Qur'an, we spoke about the Sunnah last time, pretty much same thing with the time of the Khulafa, Rashidin, the four Khulafa. Something new. The third source of legislation was ijtihad, or ijma'. The third source of legislation during the time of the Khulafa was ijma'. Now what is ijma'? Ijma' is to have a consensus. And when we say by consensus, is that all of the major Sahaba or the fuqaha of the Sahaba, they would all agree on something if they had a particular issue. Yani, if they couldn't find something in the Qur'an, they move on to the Sunnah. If they can't find it in the Sunnah, then the fuqaha of the Sahaba, they would all, if there was a particular issue, out of the understanding they get either from the Qur'an or the Sunnah or through reasoning, if they all agreed on one thing, this becomes ijma'. This becomes ijma', where they all agree that now this is a hukum and this is the legislation for that particular issue. Right? So this is what ijma' is. Now, some scholars say, they question, is ijma', the consensus of the scholars, or the fuqaha that is that only valid during the time of the Sahaba? Is it only valid during the time of the Sahaba, where they would all agree to something and it becomes haram, for example? Is that only during the time of the Sahaba? No. The answer to that is no. There is one opinion that says that no, it's only during the time of Sahaba, but that's the weaker opinion. But for the majority of the scholars, they go by that ijma' does not occur only during the time of the Sahaba. It also occurs in every time and era. So today, we can have ijma' at the same time. I'll give you a very simple example. Many years ago, before science was very, it took a very a leap of faith, so to speak. So it became like everywhere. Everyone knew science now. Before that, a lot of people used to smoke. Now, if you ever go through some like pictures, really old pictures, you'd see like a sheikh giving a khutbah, and he'll have a cigarette in his hand. It's a funny scene, but back then, they didn't understand that smoking was haram, right? But then through science, later on, they discovered that smoking kills you. Okay, smoking kills you. Before it used to be something they used to have, it was a leisure thing, it was a tasty thing, whatever it was. But now, they found out that it kills you. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says in a hadith, لا ضرر ولا ضرار, that you cannot harm yourself, nor that you can harm others. So from that, the scholars, they came to a consensus, and they all agreed that this is harming your body. So by you harming your body, you are doing something haram. So they all agreed that what? Smoking is haram. Right? There's a very weak opinion that says it's makruh. Okay? But if anything, it's makruh by who? Makruh by Allah Azza wa Jalla, so stay away from it. At the end of the day, it became ijma'. It became consensus. Something all of the scholars, they agreed upon, because this is something haram. So does it happen during the time of the Sahaba only? No, it doesn't. Now the fourth source of legislation, so we said the first was Qur'an, second was Sunnah, the third was ijma', which they all agreed upon, and the fourth was ijtihad. The fourth was ijtihad or qiyas. Now, last week I had a question, what's the difference between ijtihad or qiyas? And good thing I didn't answer it last week, because it's going to be in this talk today, inshallah. I'll speak a little bit about ijtihad, and I'll mention what qiyas really is. I'll give you the very minor differences it is between them. Now, ijtihad, linguistically, is to struggle and to broaden the scope. So let's just say you have a particular issue. Something comes up. Is this halal or haram? Or what do we do if this happens? What's the hukum? Okay. We can't find it in Qur'an. There's no source there. We can't find it in the Sunnah. No source there. Now, ijtihad, there's several guidelines, right? In which you use so you can come up with a hukum. Now, ijtihad, reasoning, when we translate it, reasoning, it comes through, when we think of it, reasoning, so you think of it logically, what could be the hukum. So you think of it using your brain. Now, it's not entirely based on the brain. Yes, you do use the brain, but it's not entirely based on the brain, right? So you use other hukum. You use other ayat that may have some sort of link in one way or another, or you broaden the scope so you can find a link to that way or to that particular issue, right? So you can't find it in the Quran or Sunnah. You can't find anything. But you may find something where you broaden the scope and you think outside the box, so much so that you can make a link out of this ayah, right? This is what ijtihad is. Where they use reasoning and they base it on, it still goes back to a source. Now, what's the difference between ijtihad and qiyas? Now, I mentioned it very briefly last week, but inshallah, ijtihad, I'll tell you what it is, the difference that is between qiyas. Ijtihad, now, do you remember how we spoke about sharia and fiqh, and how we said sharia is like the umbrella and fiqh is just a branch of it, right? Ijtihad is like the umbrella and qiyas is a branch of it. Does that make sense? If I was just to map it out like that? Yeah? Ijtihad is the umbrella and qiyas is one of it. Now ijtihad, there's many different paths. Okay? Now qiyas is by qiyas. Now ijtihad, like I said, it means to broaden the scope so you can find the link to a hukum. Qiyas, in particular, it's more specific. It mentions or it speaks about the when you use the primary hukum to come up with a secondary hukum, right? So if you have something that's haram, it's legislated in the Sharia that this is haram, and you have a specific situation, so based on what this is, you are going to make it haram, right? This is what qiyas is. We use another hukum so you can come up with this hukum. Does that make sense? Right? Easy. Hopefully. Inshallah. Now moving on, I'll give you an example in which the Sahaba, they used ijtihad. The Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum, one of the a man married a woman and he didn't consummate the marriage. Okay? So he married a woman, he's married to other women as well, but he married this woman, he didn't consummate the marriage, right? And he died. Okay. Now, what happens? Does this woman stay in her house, and so she can wait and mourn and stay in her house for the iddah, as Allah Azza wa Jal He commands? Or because she didn't consummate the marriage, she's fine? Or does she do half? Or what is it? What's the hukum here, you know? So Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he asked, it was Ibn Mas'ud. Ibn Mas'ud, he asked all the companions, is there anything out there of the Qur'an? No. Is there any nusus, any hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? No. Nothing of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He couldn't find anything. He asked all the companions, he couldn't find anything. So he said, okay, I'm going to do ijtihad. Since he married her, she is just like the other women, just because she gets her inheritance as well. Because she gets inheritance, at the same time she has to stay in her house. So she has to do her iddah. Later on, they found a hadith in which this it agrees with what Ibn Mas'ud came with, and he was very, very happy and elated that he came up with the right hukum. Now, I spoke about last week that there are 6 times of legislation. The very first was the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The second part was the time of the 4 khulafa, which is Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman and Ali. Very, very easy this time. It was just very similar to the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was the Qur'an they had for legislation. After that the Sunnah. After that ijma'. Who can tell me what ijma' is? Ijma'. Consensus. Well, all the scholars or the fuqaha of the Sahaba, they agreed to a particular matter. After that came what? Ijtihad, which is the reasoning. Now, moving on to the next part of the 6, so now we're on to the third part of legislation. And this part, I found this very, very fun when I was studying it. This is the part in which you really understand, okay, now we have really big differences of opinion. And this is why, right? And this is why. Because this is a lead up to what the 4 madhahib are today. What I'm going to speak about now is the lead up to why there's 4 schools of thoughts. There's more schools of thoughts, but there's 4 major ones, right? And this is the time of the younger companions to about the 2nd century Hijri. Now, during this period, there was 2 major schools of thoughts. Today we have 4, Shafi'i, Hanbali, Maliki, and Shafi'i. No, did I say Shafi'i? Hanafi. Afwan. Now, during that time, there was 2 schools of thoughts, right? One of them was Ahlul Ra'i, and the other one was Ahlul Hadith. Now, what is Ahlul Ra'i and what is Ahlul Hadith? Now, I want you to pay real close attention to this. Ahlul Ra'i, if you were to translate it, it's the people of reasoning, right? The people of reasoning. And the other, Ahlul Hadith, the people of Hadith. Okay? Now, each school of thought had their own ways of deriving ahkam due to its political and geographical circumstances. Now I'm going to speak about the political and the geographical circumstances of both schools, of why they had difference of opinion, right? Now, okay. During the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab, more. During the time of, during this period, there was a lot of political movements. So after the time of Ali, we know that the Shia came up, and the Khawarij came up, and there was all of these groups, Mu'tazila, and all of these groups that came up, where they would start to fabricate hadith, right? And one of the very most notorious of them was the Shia. They used to fabricate a lot of hadith. And what I mean by fabricate is that they used to say the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said A, B, C, now that becomes a law, right? So they would fabricate. They would say an this person, and this person, and this person, that this is a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam which is incorrect. And this is haram, completely haram to do, right? In fact, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, من كذب علي متعمدا فليتبوأ مقعده من النار, that whoever lies on me, on my tongue, then let him prepare himself a seat in the hellfire. And believe it or not, this hadith is mutawatir. Do you remember that word? This hadith is mutawatir to the level of Qur'an. Yani it's so authentic, it's passed down from a big group to another big group. This is the word of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying that whoever does that, then let him prepare a seat for himself in the hellfire. Now the Shia, they used to fabricate hadith, and they were located in Iraq, or in that time it was called Kufa. What was the place called? Kufa. And today we call it Iraq, and it's a bit more than just Iraq, it's like around it as well. Now in that time it was called Al-Kufa. Now this is where they were situated. This is where they were situated, the people of, the fabricators of hadith, the Shia. So in that place there was a lot of hadith that was fabricated. Okay, there was a lot of hadith that would go around the people that it was fabricated. Now, during the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab, he sent Abdullah ibn Mas'ud to where? To Kufa. Now, why did he send Abdullah ibn Mas'ud to Kufa? Because during the time of Umar, there was a lot of expansion within the Muslim empire, right? And these people in Kufa, where there's also Persians as well, they needed to learn Islam. So Umar ibn al-Khattab, he sent Abdullah ibn Mas'ud to that place. So he can what? So he can teach them Islam. Now, Umar ibn al-Khattab is one of the companions who used to use reasoning, who was a fan of ijtihad. Now, ijtihad was not used by a lot of companions. A lot of them would shy away from using ijtihad. They say if we can't find the Qur'an or Sunnah, we'd stay quiet. Okay? Now, Umar ibn al-Khattab was known to be a person who was a mujtahid. He would use ijtihad. Now, he sent Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, we can say that this person was in love with Umar ibn al-Khattab. He used to love him so much, he followed his way. So he himself, he became a person of ijtihad. So when he went to Kufa to teach the people Islam, they learned from him that one of the sources of legislation is what? Is ijtihad. Right? So now, Ahlul Ra'i, they have learnt. Now this is like the political kind of understanding of why they're called the people of reasoning. They were brought up to be the people of reasoning. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud taught them that way. He taught them Qur'an, Sunnah. If you can't find it, then it's ijtihad. Right? That was how they were brought up in Islam. So they became Ahlul Ra'i. Also, how I spoke about in that place, that there was hadith that was fabricated. Now, the people there, the scholars there, they were very, very strict on taking a hadith. If they cannot verify that this hadith is 100% from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, they don't take it. Why? Because they knew that the Shia were there and they were fabricating hadith. So in order not to fall in the haram, they won't take any hadith unless it's 100% correct to the level of mutawatir. Right? Now, this encloses the circle, it makes it smaller it makes the circle of sources very small. Right? So now you've got Qur'an and Hadith, but Hadith, we've ruled out almost half of it, or more of that is, because of the fabrications that were happening in the area. So they had a very small number of sources. So then what? They used to do ijtihad. They used to do ra'i, because back then they didn't have the sources in front of them. Now, on the other side, which was in Medina, we had Ahlul Hadith. We had what? Ahlul Hadith. Remember I said there was two schools of thought at that time. One of them was Ahlul Ra'i, the other one was Ahlul Hadith. Now Ahlul Hadith, very, very, obviously that is, in Medina is the city in which which was the first city of the Muslims. The first city which had Khilafah. It was the city in which the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he resided in until he died. It was the city in which majority of the Sahaba were. It was the city in which the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ migrated to, along with the Sahaba. So in that place, there was a lot of authentic hadith. A lot of the companions had hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that was authentic, 100% correct. Right? Now, so in this place, there was a very, very large number of hadith. And like I said earlier, a large number of the companions, they shied away from using ijtihad. They weren't very, very happy about it. They didn't like this whole idea of using ijtihad. So what would they do? They would either take from Qur'an or Sunnah. And they had many sources, many hadith that were authentic, that were from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So they would take from that and they would come up with a hukum. This is why we came up with two schools, Ahlul Hadith and Ahlul Ra'i. Right? The people of Hadith who would take only from Hadith, or they would shy away from using ijtihad, and there was the people of Ra'i who would use reasoning, and they had their political and geographic reasons. Right? Now, the culture of the people of Kufa, which I spoke about, that there's a little bit of Persians in there, right? There's a bit of Persian people in the Kufa region. Now, when the Persians entered Islam, they had a different way of life. Okay? So the Sahaba, they came up with things, we've never experienced that. At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, we never experienced it, so we don't know what to do. So they had to come up with something, what's halal, what's haram. They had to come up because their culture was very different. So that's why they had so many different questions in Kufa. Now in Kufa, because there was so many questions being asked, whether this is halal, whether this is haram, or what if this happens, what if that happens. The Ahlul Ra'i, in their method of giving a fatwa, they would give the fatwa before it needed to be given. I'm going to say that again. The people of Kufa, Ahlul Ra'i, they would give a fatwa before it even needed to be given. Right? So they used to say in a fatwa, for example, they'll say, Ara'ayta, if this happens, if such and such happens, the hukum is this. Why would they do that? Because of the many questions that they had. So they started to answer them before they even came. Now the people of Medina, they criticized them so much. Why? Because that's not how a hukum happens. You want a hukum, you wait for it to occur, and that's when you give it. And they used to really look down at the people who used to give that kind of the hukum. They used to give the hukum before it even needed to be given. So they would legislate before it even needed to be legislated. Right? So this was like the culture or the difference between both parties. Ahlul Ra'i and Ahlul Hadith. Two major schools of thoughts. Now, in Medina, like I said, the fatwas there were not really based on what if something happens. They would look into the Qur'an if they needed the fatwa. They would look in the Sunnah after that if they can't find it. And they would very rarely use ijtihad unless it was in a situation of emergency. So that's the very big difference between Ahlul Ra'i and Ahlul Hadith. طيب, Ahlul Ra'i, where were they situated? Who can tell me? Kufa, which is now known as Iraq. Now Ahlul Hadith, where were they situated? Medina. And who had the more sources? People in Kufa or Medina? Medina. Why was it that? Prophet ﷺ was there. He lived there. They had many sources there. Why was it that the people of Kufa never had a lot of hadith? One of them is because Abdullah, no, that's not the reason why they had many hadith. The reason why they never had many hadith was what? The Shia would fabricate. So that closed the circle of hadith on them. They became very strict to accept it. But Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who was he influenced by? Umar ibn al-Khattab. And Umar ibn al-Khattab was known to use what? Ijtihad. So when he went to Kufa and he taught the people of Kufa, he taught them on the manhaj of Ijtihad. So they grew up like that. Now, the people of Medina, when it came to a fatwa, would they answer it straight away? No. They would look into Qur'an, they would look into Sunnah. If they can't find it, do they use Ijtihad? Extremely rare cases they would. Okay, only like in times of like emergency. Now, in the time in the place of Kufa, would they use Ijtihad? Yes. Do they come up with a fatwa? Do they come up with a fatwa that's not even there, that's not even needed for the time? Right. So they would come up with fatwa for something that hasn't even occurred yet. Okay? For the amount of questions they would have. So this gives you the geographic and political understanding of why there is two different schools of thoughts in that period. This is the period of when? After who? After Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So after the four khulafa. Until when? The beginning of the second century. So the beginning of the second century of Islam, that is Hijri yani. This was in that time, this is what occurred. We had the people of Medina, which was Ahlul Hadith, and we had people of Kufa, which was Ahlul Ra'i. And these were two major schools of thoughts. So this was like the major schools of thoughts. So you had one large portion following this, one large portion following that. Insha'Allah, next week, we'll move on to the fourth, fifth and sixth part of legislation. So now we've covered what? The first period, which was what? First period of legislation was Prophet ﷺ's time. Second period was Khulafa al-Rashidin. Third period was after the Khulafa al-Rashidin until beginning of second century. Now, we've got the third, okay, where am I up to? Fourth, I can't even count, la ilaha illallah. We're up to the fourth, fifth and sixth. So next week, inshallah, I'll speak about those three. The very short, the major part of that is the four madhahib. And this is the very exciting part. Now, when I was doing my research into that and whatnot, I found a very, very cool timeline that shows you the life of Imam Ahmad, the life of Imam Abu Hanifa all the way to Imam Ahmad. So between Imam Abu Hanifa, then Malik, then Shafi'i, then Imam Ahmad. So there's like a really cool timeline. I've downloaded it already. I'm going to print it out inshallah. I'm going to give it to you next week, and you can actually look through it while I'm speaking to you. Now there's also a map, but subhanAllah I didn't get to print it out. But inshallah I'll print it out next week as well. The map shows you the areas of Kufa, Medina, and it also shows you which areas follow more of the Shafi'i madhab. So inshallah next week I'll also print that out and give it to you. This is the really exciting part next week where we speak about the four madhahib. Why? Because what we know today is not Ahlul Ra'i and Ahlul Hadith. That's what happened. That's what the beginning was. That's what the origin was. But today we know Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam al-Shafi'i and the rest. Right? So inshallah next week we'll be speaking about that time of legislation, how that came about, and why there's difference of opinion once again. And we can speak a little bit more about the sources and their tools in which they used to actually come up with a ruling. Inshallah, we'll end it here. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make this a beneficial lesson, something that we can always benefit from. And ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep us steadfast on His religion. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. تقدم